Okay, well, hello, Charlie,
Hi, Dan.
and hello, everyone. So here we are. We're going to do one of these in-character project videos, and we're going to talk about our research on character traits, emotion, and neuroscience. And I guess maybe we should introduce ourselves first here. I'm Dan McKaughan. I'm an associate professor in the philosophy department at Boston College.
And I'm Charlie Starkey. I'm an associate professor of philosophy and a fellow of the Rutland Institute for Ethics here at Clemson University.
Good. And so we thought today we would just have a chat about some of the research that we've done on character traits, emotions, and neuroscience. So as we're thinking, maybe I'll start out asking you some questions about your project, Charlie, and then we'll turn the tables. Okay?
Okay, very good.
Good. Okay, so some philosophers, Charlie, have tended to dismiss emotions as kind of clouding moral judgment and reasoned deliberation. Others have taken emotions to have an important role to play in motivating moral behavior. But I take it that you envision an even more central place for emotions in moral theory. Can you kind of briefly describe your basic view and just say a bit to situate the kind of view that you want to develop in the landscape of current discussion?
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for that question, Dan. Yes, I believe that emotions have a central place in moral theory, and that emotions are a central part of, more specifically, moral judgment and behavior. But what I'm going to focus on here today is something a bit more specific, namely the relation between emotion and character. And I think that this is the project that I've been focusing on here, in part because I think it's important to talk about the relation between emotion and character because there's been so little writing on the issue. You know, there has been, as you know, a tremendous amount of work on both emotion and on character in recent years, but there really hasn't been a thoroughgoing analysis of their relation, particularly one that blends philosophical work or utilizes the insights and the tools of philosophical work and the insights and tools of work from empirical psychology as well. So that's a sort of project that I've embarked on and am working on here. And I'll say that part of the reason that for the reason of this sort of neglect is that philosophers have focused on virtue rather than character, which are closely connected, but they've left unattended some broader relations between emotion and character. And I think another reason is because the big resurgence in virtue ethics or character ethics since the 1950s has been primarily Aristotelian. Not entirely, but primarily. So they've taken Aristotle's idea that feeling the right emotion at the right time and the right amount, to put it very quickly, is the mark of virtuous behavior. They've taken that as a sort of starting point, rather than systematically asking, well, why might this be the case? What other sort of alternatives are there? So it's a sort of foundational project, and I think one of the most important foundational questions for character ethics, asking and identifying why this is the case. And we shouldn't take for granted that it's the case, because emotions I don't think they're a necessary component of character in the sense that they're part of the concept of a certain character trait, you know, being judicious or courageous or something like that. There's no part of the concept of those that necessarily involves emotion. And it's not right to say that emotions are relevant, let's say, because they reflect our character, because then what they are something that is a sign of our character, something that identifies our character, but that's not being part of character itself. So what I think if emotions are in some way essential to character, which is what I want to argue, that it lies in the sort of relation of emotions in the production or the sustenance of character traits. So that's the sort of thing that I argue, and that's in the broadest sense the sort of view that I have, that emotions, by virtue of their effect on sustaining and producing character traits, are relevant to character.
Okay, well, why don't we start out just, can you tell us a bit about how you're thinking about what character traits are? So,
yes.
what is a character trait supposed to be?
Well, and I think this is another question that's gone largely unaddressed, partly because of the focus on virtue and virtues. But in the last 40 or 50 years, there have only been a handful of sort of close analyses of what character traits are, or what character traits might be. And this is a really pressing sort of issue, in part because of the situationist attacks on the whole idea of character that have come up in recent years. Now, if we're going to settle this debate, well, then we need to have a clear idea of what the thing under discussion, the entity under discussion is. We need to get clear on that. And it's only after that we can only really assess how and to what extent empirical studies weigh in on whether or not there are character traits, or to what extent there are character traits. So that's another sort of foundational issue that has been not entirely but largely overlooked. So my view of character traits is that character traits are dispositions to sorts of actions that involve a dynamic relation between various values. And it's not a matter of any one value being involved. It's, again, this dynamic relation between values. So character traits are what you might say type identified by a particular value, such as honesty being identified by the value of accurate representation. But in any instance where we're displaying a certain character trait, there are different values at play. There are typically several different values at play. It's not simply a matter of one value always dominating what we do. I mean, imagine a person who was who had a certain sort of value, such as the value of accurate representation, that dominated all the time. You can think of many instances where that really wouldn't be the appropriate sort of thing. So it's, again, how the various values work with each other, and which ones rise up and you could say dominate our thoughts and our behavior and produce actions in accord with it. So that's the basic model of character traits that I have.
Okay, Charlie, so how does emotion relate to character traits? It seems like you've said that character traits are kind of clusters of values, and then you've said that emotions are going to play a role in producing and sustaining character traits. How are you thinking about that relation?
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. There are a couple key ways that in my analysis, identify a couple of key ways in which emotions play a central sort of role in the possession and the sustenance of character traits. In other words, in underlying the possession of character traits. And here, I hold that emotions are essential, first on what I call a proximal level, that emotions affect character traits because of their effects on perception. And here I survey the psychological literature on emotion and perception, which has been largely overlooked. There's been a lot of work on emotion and reason and so forth since, for well over a decade now, but there's been very little consideration of the large literature on emotion and perception that's existed in psychology, let's say going back to the 1950s, but also some very important new literature that's just come out over the past, let's say, 5 to 7 years. So I've amassed this, and based on it, identified several specific types of ways that emotions affect morally relevant perception. So I'll start here by talking about the ways in which emotions affect morally relevant perception.
Okay.
And yeah, so first they affect the focus of our attention. That is how broad or narrow our attention is. And that's our ability to, or our disposition to focus on certain sorts of objects or situations. So that's one important way that they affect our perception. Another way is that they affect whether or not we see something at all. That they can affect our perception so that we notice figures, let's say, that might otherwise be lost in background visual information, but for having the emotion, we're able to recognize those. And then there's some fascinating work that's been done very recently that shows quite literally what we see, like the figure that we see, can depend on our values or desires and our emotional relation to those values and desires. So at the level of mere perception, what we see is changed by virtue of having some sort of emotional connection to it. In addition, it affects how we understand what we perceive in terms of, let's say, in terms of our values and interests. And I know I'm using the word understand here, but what I mean is in the act of perceiving something in which I call a cognitively rich sort of way or a cognitively thick sort of way, emotions affect what we perceive in relation to important sort of values or concerns that we have, and thus the way that we immediately make sense of the object of perception. So what I've identified there is basically 4 different ways that emotions affect our perception. And that's what I call the sort of fundamental level of effect of emotions on perception. In addition, there's pardon me. That's what I call the proximal level. In addition, there's a fundamental relation between emotion and character traits. I call it fundamental because it's something that doesn't involve necessarily the immediate effects of emotion on our perception in real time, but rather this fundamental level involves the way in which emotions underlie the persistence of character traits by preventing what I call axiological entropy. And a big word, but what it basically means is that over time, our sense of the importance of various values that character traits are based on will diminish, will fade. That's why I refer to it as axiological entropy. Axiology refers to values, and entropy refers to this sort of disillusion over time. So think to yourself about things that have been very important to you at a time, but then over time you simply don't care about them as much. I mean, to take a nice sort of on the ground example, think about a hobby, an activity, or something like that that you enjoyed because you've really enjoyed it, but you've enjoyed being involved with it with your friends. And then suddenly, let's say you don't have friends that are interested in that anymore. Well, over time, your interest in that can, without any sort of support, can fade and diminish. So that's what I provide is anecdotal there, but there is work that supports this idea of axiological entropy. I think probably the most prominent sort of example is the psychological concept of extinction. That over time, certain sort of responses to things, in this case, what I call value properties, will diminish over time. So that values that were important to you at one time, without having those sorts of that sense of importance kept up and even in some cases restored, it will simply diminish over time on account of, or it's explained in part by this concept of extinction. So what emotions do is help maintain and reinforce these sort of values. this is on account of the association of a value property with an emotional state. That serves to maintain our sense of the importance of it. So you can think of something like the value of accomplishment. Part of what makes accomplishments important to us, valuable to us, is a sort of reinforcement that we get through our emotional responses. Some of those emotional responses are brought about by other people. We see people applaud and praise and accomplishments that other people achieve. People praise accomplishments that we achieve, and so forth. So what that does is help generate emotional responses in us. For instance, when you are praised, and that serves to uphold the value of accomplishment. So that's at a very quick and sort of skeletal level the way that emotions serve to maintain or determine character traits. First, through perception, the way that we see the world affects how we think about and in turn act about the world. So by affecting perception, emotions perceive how we think and act, and thus the character traits that are associated with those. But then, in addition to that, by sustaining and supporting our sense of the importance of various values that character traits are based on, they help preserve and sustain character traits.
Okay, so does your view support a kind of sentimentalism then? A kind of view that moral judgments are fundamentally expressions of emotion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll say my work on character and the broader work is yes and no. And here I think it's useful to distinguish between narrow and broad sentimentalism. Narrow sentimentalism, or what I'll call narrow sentimentalism, is the view that moral judgments are the expressions of emotions. And my view doesn't support this type of sentimentalism. It doesn't support it in the strict sense because my work claims that moral judgments can be cognitive, or it's compatible with my view that moral judgments can be cognitive. That is, make certain sort of claims about things. But there is also a broader view of sentimentalism, which is the view that emotions are in some way essential to, let's say, moral judgment, moral thoughts, attitudes, behaviors, and so forth. Now, my view does support sentimentalism, very much within that camp, in terms of that broader sense of sentimentalism. What I've called it sometimes in the past is my theory is a sort of epistemic sentimentalism. That is, emotions, by directing our attention, by having this important role in determining our perception, affects what we come to understand, to see, to understand, and to believe. So, and that's why I refer to it as a sort of epistemic sentimentalism. Although the second part of the argument I make about the relation between emotions and the values that underlie character traits, that would be better called a sort of axiological sentimentalism. So again, to sum up my answer to your question, then it is a sort of sentimentalism, but my work doesn't support the more narrow view, or it doesn't support in the sense of marking it out as the right version of sentimentalism, the narrower sort of sentimentalism that holds that moral judgments are simply expressions of emotions or something like that.
So speaking of the cognitive element of moral judgment, I mean, is a person of good character someone who reasons through to the right thing, or?
Is a person of good character someone who reasons to the right thing? Well, my answer to that is sometimes, but not necessarily, not always. A person of good character can be someone who reasons through to the right thing, and there are many situations in life where that's how we should behave. That's how we should go about addressing a problem, thinking through it. But there are many situations that involve character that don't involve any sort of explicit deliberation. Most pointedly, in situations where people are acting in real time, there's very little time for deliberation. That's not to say there isn't a lot of thought of one sort or another involved, but there isn't any sort of explicit reasoning through to the right thing. So again, I think the person of good character isn't someone who always, let's say, reasons through to the right thing. And in addition to that, even when someone reasons through to the right sort of thing, emotions play a role in what they reason about. That is what is salient to them, what they perceive, either out in the world around us or what they perceive in what you could call their mind's eye, and even in situations where there isn't an occurrent sort of emotion. And as I argue, the tacit sense of the importance of various things, particularly values, that they reason about is based on emotions. So reason can play an important sort of role here, and there can be, but even in situations where somebody is using deliberative reason, emotion is still playing a role in informing us and presenting certain sort of senses of importances and certain sort of objects to our reason. So this isn't a simple sort of follow your heart theory of emotion, if that's a theory. I'll say the reason plays a very important role by enabling us to sort through information and, let's say, to discount the promptings of occurrent emotions. Emotions can be a very good thing, but there are, of course, so many examples of emotions that make people do the wrong thing. And so reason plays a very important role of helping us to either discount or ignore the promptings of emotional episodes in favor of courses of actions that are more in line with our values or what we take to be really important. So I believe, and here I sound Aristotelian, although I come about it sort of through the long analytical way. So what we should aim for is well-developed emotions, as well as well-developed reason, because let's not forget that reason can be poor and out of attunement, just as reason can be sharp and well-tuned.
So you've argued that emotions play a vital role in moral perception. Could you say a little bit more about what moral perception is? I think of visual perception, and there ordinarily we think that what I perceive, what I see, I see books on your shelf there, and the bookshelves, I see you. So we think that these are caused by things out there in the world. Now, how are you thinking about moral perception? Am I seeing stuff out there, or how is that relationship?
Okay, good. I see a couple different things in there. One is what moral perception is, and the other something about the relation between moral perception and moral facts. So I'll address each of those in turn. So first of all, so far as what moral perception is, what I have a theory of moral perception, and this is a concept that's become much more common in recent years, but very little work looking at exactly what a moral perception is or might be. But I argue that moral perception is morally relevant perception. So I have a very broad understanding of what moral perception is. And that this morally relevant perception, of course, very much affects our character. So moral perception, one kind of moral perception is what I call normative moral perception. That is the perception of right and wrong, or the perception of things as right or wrong, or morally good and bad. So, for instance, we can perceive the arrogance in someone's attitudes and behavior. We see it as arrogant and thus morally condemnable. So that's normative moral perception, where where let's say moral concepts are deployed or part of the perception that we have. But moral perception includes normative moral perception, but is broader. And for example, an insensitive person, somebody with a character trait or someone who acts in an episode in a way that's insensitive, may not notice another person in need. And this in turn, let's say, often says something about their character. But notice that their perception doesn't necessarily involve the deployment of any sort of moral concepts. Not noticing someone in need, or in turn noticing someone in need, particularly in a situation where it's not obvious, or there are other sort of distractors, other things vying for our attention. Neither of those necessarily involve moral concepts, but it is moral perception in that it is morally relevant perception, the kind of perception that makes someone sensitive or insensitive. So normative moral perception is the narrower is one type of this broader range of moral perception. And so that's what I believe moral perception is. Now, how it compares to other ideas about perception, as you said, we see books on the bookcase, see the poster tube and things like that. Well, so we see things as we encounter the world around us. We see things in a sheer physical sort of way. But let's not take for granted that. Let me back up. So we see things around us that seem like physical objects. That I'll grant right here and now that they are physical objects. I'm not going to be Leibniz.
Okay.
Right. Okay. But we recognize other things as well. That is, we recognize certain properties and things that I'd say are real that supervene on other sorts, supervene on, let's say, the situations we see, the objects we see, the situations that we see people in. So moral perception can involve the perception of properties that stand above the physical properties of a situation. And a way of putting this, as I've just done, is that it involves the recognition of properties that supervene on, that is, are based on, but not straightforwardly reducible to the sort of material objects, as I'll say, material objects of our perception. So the property of rudeness doesn't depend on any narrow range of physical properties. Rudeness can be instantiated in a wide variety of different situations that are otherwise dissimilar. And the same thing applies to courage and kindness. So I believe we do perceive these properties in the sense of what I've earlier called thick perception, sort of perception that's cognitively richer than bare sensory information. So we have the ability to recognize these various sort of clusters of physical properties and their relation to each other, and then recognize, for example, that one of those clusters is an instance of kindness or of rudeness or something like that. And let's also not forget that I think the distinction between these might not be, it might be something that's more along a scale rather than you have these invisible sort of properties such as rudeness, and then you have the real physical material objects of perception. Well, there might be something more like a gradation between the two. And an example of this is, let's say, the perception of a duck-rabbit figure as a duck or as a rabbit. We perceive it as a duck, let's say, and doing this involves the deployment of duck-related sort of concepts. This is similar. It's one way of understanding the way in which moral perception involves the perception of moral sort of properties. Now, so far as moral realism goes, I'll say that my argument is compatible with moral realism or some sort of moral constructivism. It doesn't depend on the idea that what we're perceiving are real objective moral properties in some sort of way. It's perfectly compatible with that, but it doesn't depend on that.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, we could develop, for good reasons, sensitivity to certain sort of social norms, certain sort of traits that are conducive to thriving in specific sorts of ways. I won't say anything more about that. Of course, there's a whole literature about that. The important point here is that my work is compatible with several different sorts of view about the nature and status of moral properties.
Fair enough. So, Charlie, it seems to me that one important practical implication of your project, so if we grant that emotions are playing an important role both in moral perception and character, moral judgment, is that it would be important to try to cultivate the right sorts of emotional responses, helping us to attend to salient features of situations that we're kind of sizing up from a moral perspective and then maybe attending to and acting on these moral perceptions. Do you want to say a bit about how you see the practical implications?
Yes. So far as the practical implications go, the takeaway from this is that it's important to develop our emotions, not simply to have them any sort of binary way, but to have the right emotional response at the right sort of time to specific situations. Also developing emotional dispositions that can help us perceive better. One way in which this is evidence is that there is research, very recent research, that let's say high intensity emotions narrow our focus, and low intensity emotions, whether negative or positive, actually broaden our focus. So emotions can be important in that even moderate amount of emotions can help sort of broaden our attention. There we notice more things, as we're more apt to see opportunities, as some psychologists have argued, develop relationships and so forth. In addition to this more narrowing sort of effect to more specific sort of targets that intense emotions have. So developing the right emotions in the right amount would be an important sort of goal, because as I've suggested there, they affect what we see, what we pay attention to, and so forth. But in addition, developing or continually using emotional responses that are paired with certain sorts of values to keep those values alive, pretty literally, to help maintain them, and not just maintain the values, again, not in a binary way, but give the values the right sort of rough level of importance that those values should have. Beyond that, there's an issue of what's known as practical wisdom, dealing with competing values and adjudicating between them. But before we get to the issue of the necessity of practical wisdom for virtue, people need to have these values in the right sort of amount. So there are many ways in which this can happen, such as the pairing of emotional responses in the presence of certain sort of value properties. We develop a sort of association between the two. Another way is the way in which, or is the phenomenon of what one psychologist has called emotional communion, how being with other people and being involved with them in the expression of emotion towards a common sort of object, a common sort of situation, event, person, again helps reinforce the sort of emotional response. There, it's very much part of a group rather than an individual emotional response that somebody has in a certain situation. So that's the second way that developing, or the second way in which developing emotions is very important. So the issue would be, or the sort of task would be, doing a good job of emotional development.
So, Charlie, as you know, some thinkers who agree that the empirical evidence shows that emotional responses are playing a significant role in moral judgment have also taken that to kind of undermine moral judgment. So it seems E.O. Wilson, his book Sociobiology, for example, famously expressed skepticism about the practice of relying on emotions or intuitions in moral judgment. And I guess that the basic thought seems to be, well, if these evolved very long ago in social situations that are much different than ones that we face in complex sort of modern societies. He famously says, that we shouldn't rely too much on the hypothalamus and the limbic system in driving these decisions. It seems like people like Josh Green have also suggested that, gosh, if we really, our emotionally based responses may be best attuned for kind of up close and personal encounters, but maybe not so good at adjudicating very abstract, large scale, problems in modern society. How do you see? It seems like you envision a more positive role for emotional judgment. So how would you respond to or interact with these kinds of skeptical conclusions that people are arguing for?
Okay, good. I think that's a really interesting question, and it's one that in some way echoes a claim by Peter Singer, a similar sort of claim where he argues that moral decisions should be based on moral principles and moral reasoning, and that, or because common moral intuitions are false, a product of outdated norms and prejudices. One point Singer asks, well, why should we not rather make the opposite assumption from endorsing our intuitions? And that's that all the particular moral judgments that we intuitively make are likely to derive from, among other things, customs necessary to the survival of the group in social and economic circumstances that now lie in the distant past. In which case, Singer adds, it would be best to forget all about our particular moral judgments and start again from as near as we can to self-evident moral axioms. So he's making an argument that's like Wilson's and Green's, maybe a little bit of both at the same time. I would respond that emotional attunement is better than ignoring emotions for a couple of reasons. One is that if we are emotionally attuned, that is, if we are emotionally well developed, we're going to operate more efficiently. That is because there won't be the competition between our emotions and the deliverances of our emotions and the deliverances of what our reason says. So we'll be able to act better as moral beings. Elliot Sober's made an argument somewhat like this in looking at why altruism would develop. He has a very nice argument there. But in addition, because of the demonstrated sort of effects of emotions on perception, for instance, it's very often not a simple choice between consulting our emotions or not consulting our emotions. That is, they're always already operating, steering our perception and the tacit weight that we give to our perceptions. And research has demonstrated that many of our emotions are the product of higher reasoning and learning. That is, involving pathways between the cortex and the amygdala, to talk about specific brain systems here. Not just between, let's say, crude low-level brain pathways, such as the sensory thalamus and the amygdala. The importance of this is that the emotions themselves can be the product of the more developed, more critical portions of our brain, and thus lend themselves to the sort of emotional development that I've been talking about earlier. Something that I'll say on this point that directed more at Green's claim regarding the consequentialist approach, again, properly tuned emotions, you could argue, will actually enable us to better think and act in ways that produce good consequences than just reason alone. So there can be consequential reasons to focus on developing emotions rather than ignoring them. So this view, I think, is compatible with consequentialism, and is something that a consequentialist should even endorse, so long as the emotions are the right sort of emotions. In addition, and this is something I won't get into here, but Green, it's interesting you bring up that, because the endorsement of consequentialism can be problematic for reasons brought up, most famously. Forceful objections include the utility monster or integrity objections, where if we follow consequentialism, plain and simple, we wind up giving up or violating some very important other sort of considerations that we have. Okay, good. All right, Dan. Well, I'd like to ask you a few questions at this point about your research. So first of all, just in broad terms, could you say a little bit about your current project and how you got interested in it?
Yeah, sure. Good. So I work in the history and philosophy of science, and so, I should say just right up front that I'm neither a neuroscientist nor even an ethicist. But I am I'm enthusiastic about science, and I'm interested in thinking about the implications that advances in scientific understanding have for our ordinary understanding of persons. We see ourselves as free and as moral agents who can act for reasons and have intentions, that sort of thing. And so I've been looking at some specific research on vasopressin and oxytocin, two neuropeptides that have been thought to have kind of profound implications for moral philosophy. And particularly there's been a lot of hype about this in the media. And so part of my project has been to go back and read the science on which some of the claims are based, and then part of what I've attempted to do is to deflate some of the hype. And I think that much of the research has far less profound implications for moral philosophy than some people have suggested, but that there are some issues worth taking seriously here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting. And it sounds to me like it's important what you're doing here, showing how, or as you're saying, to what extent this new knowledge applies to traditional ideas in character ethics.
That's right.
Very good. Well, so you've referenced oxytocin, but tell us about several of the main areas of scientific research that you've looked at here.
Right. Okay. So one area has actually been research on voles, which are these small kind of mouse-like rodents, and looking at both the oxytocin and the vasopressin systems in voles. And it's interesting, so there are several different species of voles. There are prairie voles, which are socially monogamous in their behavior. They pair bond and exhibit kind of a lot of frequent side-by-side contact and biparental care, even. And then, on the other hand, there's several other species. There's montane and meadow voles, which are indiscriminate in their mating habits and don't exhibit the same level of parental care from the male. And so, as neuroscientists have learned about the processes and mechanisms underlying this behavior, exploring the oxytocin and vasopressin systems. They've been able to manipulate that system in a number of ways. And one of the things that they can do is they can do what's called a viral vector transfer. They insert some of the genes from the prairie voles into the montane or meadow vole brains. So they express lots of the vasopressin receptor in the ventral forebrain, the ventral pallidum of the kind of right up in the front of the vole brain. And it turns out that when they do this, that the ordinarily kind of promiscuous or montane and meadow voles start acting much more like the prairie voles. They exhibit, more partner preference and this huddling behavior, biparental care that's characteristic of prairie voles. So, it looks like the manipulation of a single gene can have a profound influence on a complex social behavior in voles, right? And so this, of course, raises all sorts of questions about how, if at all, or to what extent this is going to apply in human behavior, and so some of the work I've done has been critically examining those kinds of translational claims. But we do have this same vasopressin receptor, the V1AR gene that the voles have, and in fact, the oxytocin and vasopressin systems are ancient and highly conserved. All mammals have vasopressin and oxytocin, and indeed, analogs of these molecules, structurally similar molecules, go back 700 million years. So these are ancient and highly conserved systems, and there have been some attempts to begin studying the effects of these systems in humans. So, of course, they're much more difficult to study directly in humans, but they've done some studies showing an association between variation in the promoter sequence of this vasopressin receptor gene and the reported quality of long-term relationships on this study exhibit. And then there's also, in the last 15 years or so, been a lot of research directly on the effects of oxytocin in humans. So many of these studies have used nasal spray. So we've got an exogenous administration of oxytocin. And oftentimes they'll have participants in a study take some of the nasal spray, 2 teaspoons or so of oxytocin, and then play various kinds of investment games. And, there have been some interesting findings that people who are given oxytocin seem to exhibit higher levels of sort of generous behavior in these games, and also sort of trust-related behavior. And so it seems, that levels of oxytocin are influencing, social perception, cognition, or the way that people are participating in some of these games.
Okay, very, very interesting. Well, then it sounds like one implication of this research is that arguably our motivations and intentions are in large part chemically controlled. Well, if this is the case, what are the implications then for character ethics?
That's going to depend both on what sorts of claims are being made by a particular ethical theory, and then also on the extent of control that we're talking about here. So, certainly we'll want to say something about both of those aspects. So, taking the first issue of what kinds of claims, I think for any particular ethical theory that we're talking about, we should ask about what the empirical content is, right? So in virtue ethics, virtue theory, oftentimes people are operating with some sort of a conception of what we should aspire to be like, kind of picture of who we ought to be. But then also some theories are going to make certain assumptions or claims about who we are, as biological organisms, and what we're like, and then maybe have some things to say about how we get from who we are to who we ought to be, right? Now, we can distinguish between what I call a purely aspirational ethical theory, which would, just be interested in making normative claims about who we ought to be, holding up, certain ideals or moral exemplars, inviting us to share a kind of rich set of value judgments or certain character traits that we admire, regard as sort of excellences that we should try to cultivate or eschew. We could use fiction to portray various kinds of heroes and villains, and there'd be a lot we could learn just in terms of developing kind of more nuanced concepts to evaluate ethical dimensions of the situation, maybe cultivate our emotions in the way that you were suggesting, regulate our emotional responses, identify morally salient features of a situation. And I think, so that's sort of a theory, probably there aren't going to be a lot of implications from empirical research, provided that the assumptions or claims that an ethicist is making about human nature, they may just be, quite vague or minimal, not likely to be the sort of thing that's going to come into conflict with scientific advances. But I think it's also the case that many virtue theorists in particular have been interested in a much deeper and closer connection with the details of empirical psychology. Aristotle was himself very interested in biology and moral psychology, and, that tradition has continued. And, so there are various ways that one may be making more substantive empirical claims as part of an ethical theory. So let me give you an example. One example is that some virtue theorists have taken on the goal of using character traits, appealing to character traits in the explanation and prediction of behavior, right? So we want to ask why someone behaved as they did in a particular situation. We might appeal to a character trait. Well, this person was courageous or is a compassionate person, and we appeal to character traits in sort of explaining and predicting behavior, right? So I think that kind of a project does raise the possibility that the explanations and predictions would either come into contact with and perhaps even compete with scientific theories that might be offered in the same phenomenal domain, explaining behavior, whether at the level of social psychology, personality psychology, or in the neurosciences.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So, can character traits, or actually, I'll ask this. So, one thing you looked at specifically was what implications the oxytocin research might have for the mixed trait view that Christian Miller has recently defended. How is Miller thinking about character traits? And do you think that his view and others like it can accommodate what we're learning in this area of neuroscience?
Yeah, so Christian Miller, the head of the Character Project, has been developing a view of character traits, and he takes character traits to be clusters of causal dispositions certain kinds of dispositional beliefs and desires, right? So if we're thinking about a particular trait like compassion in certain relevant situations, a person would be apt to form beliefs like, that person is in need. Maybe I ought to do something. That sort of thing. So he's cashing out the notion of character traits in terms of folk psychological concepts like dispositional beliefs and desires, right? I mean, because you wouldn't want to have a theory where you could get competition even at the level of, well, if someone is appealing to character traits to explain and predict behavior, someone else is appealing to beliefs and desires to explain and predict behavior. Those could, you could wonder, well, if we could do all of the explanatory and predictive work with beliefs and desires, then we wouldn't really need this, extra postulation of character traits. But Miller identifies character traits with dispositional beliefs and desires. And many of the so he's drawn on an extensive body of psychological research, both in social psychology and personality psychology, and many of the best theories, like the cognitive affective personality system, CAPS model, also seem to be bottoming out in things like dispositional beliefs, desires, intentions, plans, that sort of thing, right? So, so in principle, you can see the relevance of neuroscience if something like limitivism with respect to folk psychology turned out to be the case. As Paul and Patricia Churchland argued for many years, that really we don't have beliefs and desires. These are, have the status of phlogiston or witches or something like that. Then that would be a problem for Miller's view and many others, right? And similarly, if some version of epiphenomenalism turned out to be true. So the thought was that mental states aren't really causally involved in bringing about the behavior. They're more like, the whistles on a train engine, something like that. They're just sort of along for the ride, but causally inert. That would be a problem for the kind of view that some virtue theorists are developing. And I think here, there's a reasonable response available to someone like Miller who could just say, well, look, beliefs and desires, folk psychology is still the best game in town, and in fact, arguably indispensable for understanding the kind of behaviors, the kind of actions that ethicists typically have in view, right? That seems reasonable, but so this is just a point about the in-principle relevance of some work. There'd also be, I think there'd be other ways that future neuroscience might develop that would bring the explanatory project into contact with it. So if it turned out, certain behaviors or traits were far less under one's voluntary control than people have been assuming, that might lead you to reassess the moral status of either the behavior and trait or question, depending on, further views that you might take about what's required for moral responsibility, right? So if you did assume that being morally responsible for a trait requires that at least at some point in the process, there were choices involved in the acquisition or maintenance of a trait. There's something that you could have done for which you're legitimately sort of praised or blamed or held responsible, and then it turned out that a particular trait in question was much less under one's control than had previously been assumed, then you might not think that it was subject to the same kind of moral evaluation, right? I think, there'd also be a more complex set of ways in which neuroscience could be relevant. So one question is just this question of what grounds character traits ontologically, right? So Miller has said that character traits are dispositional beliefs and desires. And if it turns out that some form of mind-brain identity theory is correct, that these dispositional beliefs and desires just are certain kinds of states of the brain or properties, neurophysiological properties, processes, then I think that's actually compatible with Miller's view. I don't think there would be a problem there. And, in giving explanations of a person's behavior, either at the level of character traits or dispositional mental states, psychological states, or at the level of neurobiology, it may just be at each of these levels, you're ultimately sort of talking about the same things, and the level at which explanations will be relevant or useful depends on context and interest, that sort of thing, right? But it might be that the relation between mental and physical states wouldn't go so smoothly, right? So it might turn out to be much more complex. There might be a kind of fragmentation that occurs. It seems to me that what we're doing, that what many moral theorists have been doing, is picking out normative categories that play certain roles in normative discourse, in claims about, how we ought to act and be. And, at least we can well imagine that those categories picked out for those purposes wouldn't be the ones that would be most relevant for a scientific description of the causal pathways involved in explaining and predicting behavior. In fact, as you're aware, Paul Griffiths has argued that something like this has happened for emotions, right? And this is controversial, but he claims that we had this sort of folk category of emotions, and that as psychology and biology has advanced, that this has been fragmented into, basically, he draws on Ekman's categories of sort of basic emotional responses like, anger and sadness and disgust, and then thinks that those tend to be produced by certain parts of our more primal neural structures, maybe, the hypothalamus and amygdala, the limbic system that E.O. Wilson was talking about. And then there are sort of higher cognitive emotions, that are said to follow very different causal pathways in the brain, right? So, again, that's controversial even in the case of emotions, but just in principle, it doesn't seem out of the question to me that something similar could happen for the character trait categories that have been picked out normatively.
And interesting. So how should we think about the oxytocin nasal spray studies?
Right. Yeah. So, here I think that Miller can draw on a position that he's already developed to handle certain cases in the social psychology literature, right? So Robert Barron famously conducted a set of experiments in shopping malls in which passerby would be confronted, someone would drop an item, and the frequency with which people would help them, stop to pick up the item or something, the frequency with which people would exhibit helping behavior was found to depend significantly on certain fragrances or odors that were in the air at the shopping mall. So they'd do a study next to a Cinnabon or Mrs. Fields cookies, right? And people would be more likely to help given that there's the smell of freshly baked cookies in the air, right? And so, there you have a case in which the frequency of helping behavior is clearly being influenced by a factor that doesn't seem morally relevant to the situation. That's not the thing that you'd cite as a reason when asked why you stopped to help in that case. And in particular, it's also happening at a kind of unconscious level, right? And a lot of psychologists think, well, so what's happening is the pleasant fragrance puts people maybe in a better mood, and so then we're more inclined to help when we're in a better mood. And so I think that a case like that is structurally similar to a case in which oxytocin is being administered by a nasal spray. So here we have some sort of environmental stimulus that is affecting, maybe in the case of fragrance, maybe mood. In the case of oxytocin, maybe it's something like empathy or, at least heightened social awareness, cognition of some kind. And so our behavior is being influenced by a factor at the unconscious level that seems to be a morally problematic or ambiguous factor that's not, again, a reason for helping more often or being more generous or trusting. But Miller's view can handle a case like that because, unlike traditional virtue theorists, Miller's thesis is that most of us don't have traditional virtues or vices. Very often, the traits that most people have are much more mixed or ambiguous from a moral perspective. They exhibit some positive features, some negative features, but they seem to be contingent on factors like feeling embarrassed or desiring to look good in front of others that disqualify them from counting as traditional virtues, but are more mixed from a moral perspective. And so I think Miller's view is able to handle a case like the oxytocin nasal spray without any ad hoc adjustments in this new sort of area that wasn't directly under consideration as he developed the view.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, following from some of that, and you might have covered some of this ground already, but can character traits still be used to explain and predict attitudes and behavior, though they have been shown to have specific underlying neural and biological substrates? That is, does removing our significant voluntary control from our conception of character traits, does it really challenge our conception of them? And would this get around the concern with fragmentation that you outlined?
Well, so I think I would see the issue of predictive and explanatory usefulness of traits as distinct from questions about voluntary control and responsibility, right? So, because you could probably, you might try to explain and predict a vole's behavior based on certain kinds of trait attributions, even if these traits are involuntary, right? Even if the vole lacks control of the traits, they might be very useful in explaining and predicting behavior, but we wouldn't hold the vole morally responsible, say, right? And so, similarly, I think the issue of fragmentation is distinct from the issue of voluntary control. So Paul Griffith's claim about emotions was that these play no predictive or explanatory role in a developed sort of biological explanation of behavior or affective responses, right? That they're going to be more specific categories, the affective program response of an Ekman, say, or the higher cognitive emotions that are going to be used to explain. So, okay. So there's the issue of predictive and explanatory control, and then or usefulness, and then the issue of voluntary control and responsibility. And here I do think that things get more controversial because philosophers take very different views, both about what's required for self-control or freedom, larger issues of free will, and then also defend different views about what moral responsibility would require. Under what circumstances would concepts like praise and blame, be appropriate, right? So some ethicists distinguish character traits from non-character traits precisely on the basis of whether or not one has an appropriate degree of control. Again, at some point in the acquisition or maintenance of the trait, right? And if someone doesn't have any control, so take my blue eyes, for example, right? I mean, if there's a fairly straightforward relationship between genotype and phenotype, at least under normal developmental conditions, I don't have a choice whether I have blue eyes or not, and so usually we don't take that to be an appropriate object of praise or blame, right? And so if it turned out that particular traits were kind of like that, then that might lead you to think that they're not really appropriate objects of moral evaluation, right? Now, of course, these kinds of discussions are going to be tied to larger questions about free will. And so I should say that if one accepts a kind of compatibilist view, I think that there are going to be ways about thinking about moral responsibility that would be compatible with a kind of total causal determinism, right? And so usually the relevant factor there is whether or not the chain of causal events leading to my behavior runs through the will or through my beliefs and desires rather than not, right? But of course, many philosophers, both hard determinists and libertarians, would defend a kind of incompatibilist notion of free will and take it that genuine freedom is going to require the ability to do otherwise, to act between alternative possibilities, to choose to refrain from performing an act or choose to perform it, right? And it seems to me that on a view like that questions about the extent to which someone has control over character traits or even motivational states might be influenced chemically, are going to make a difference to how one thinks about whether or not they're morally responsible for having that trait.
So suppose that the effects of oxytocin are almost entirely socially beneficial. As you pointed out elsewhere, they aren't all socially beneficial, but let's assume that they are. And knowing this, someone chooses to artificially boost their oxytocin levels. Now, question for you, are they a person of especially good character, given that they display virtuous attitudes and actions characteristic of virtuous traits, and in this case have made active choices to foster those virtuous attitudes and actions?
Okay, right. So let me first just include some caveats about oxytocin and pro-social behavior. Because I think oxytocin doesn't show that the effects are almost entirely socially beneficial. There is also some research worth mentioning that shows that oxytocin can increase not just trust and empathy, but also things like envy and gloating, in-group favoritism, that sort of thing. So some of the coverage that it's got, especially in the media, has been the kind of one-sided characterization of oxytocin as, the moral molecule. And I think there's some reasons to be very cautious and circumspect about that. Second, it's not just the levels of oxytocin that matter. Researchers are manipulating inputs into very complex causal systems here within sort of developing organisms that are context dependent. So the effects of oxytocin levels, depend on the density and distribution of receptors in various parts of the brain. Both oxytocin and vasopressin interact with other signaling molecules. They're closely tied to the dopamine reward pathway. And serotonin, dopamine, and vasopressin all have multiple receptor subtypes that can give you different, even opposite effects, depending on which receptors are activated. So, those are some complications. And indeed, Jennifer Bartz has argued that it may be a mistake to conceive of oxytocin as having sort of broad and invariant effects on character or persons, because they're so context dependent and can affect different individuals in different ways. So, for example, people with borderline personality disorder, giving them oxytocin may actually hinder trust and cooperation in some of those individuals, at least under the circumstances some of the studies were done. Okay, so with those caveats in place, so you're asking the hypothetical question about artificial enhancement of traits, basically. Would they still count as virtues if we enhance them chemically? And here I think things get more controversial, right? I mean, I think of things like use of performance-enhancing drugs in athletics is often regarded as cheating, right? And so, I could see some people saying, oh, these are being used as kind of pharmacological substitutes for will and character, right? Or, maybe, in becoming a kind of morally virtuous person, you might have to accompany, it might be that sort of some kind of pill that you could take or chemical genetic alteration that could be done, would still need to be accompanied by certain types of moral education, that sort of thing that would help you to act in the right way, for the right reason at the right time, that sort of thing. But it might also be, and it might be that if we were viewing oxytocin primarily as an enhancer, as I suggested Christian Miller that might also sort of push you to regard the resulting behavior as sort of not morally virtuous, right? But I think it is also the case that sometimes we might care more about the results or outcomes than we do about how you get there, right? So I can see, suppose that someone has a certain neurological condition that makes it difficult for them to empathize with other people or to feel remorse. Maybe, as a clinical diagnosis of psychopathy might indicate, or, if you have difficulty sort of reading social emotions, it might just be that someone would regard it as a wonderful thing if there was a way to make available a whole range of emotional responses that previously were unavailable to them, right? So if that's the sort of thing that could, help a person to act more compassionately, to be more sympathetic and less prone to violent acts, something like that. That might be a good thing independently of whether or not someone was counting it as a virtue or not.
Okay, very good. So I think one more question that falls somewhat in line with this, which is that the ancient Greeks held that luck plays a major role in human virtue and in more specific virtuous traits. So are chemical levels then just one more example of the role of luck in human virtue?
Well, I think it's right that Aristotle clearly recognizes, and Hippocrates, that we are rational animals and social animals, right? That as biological organisms, our moral thoughts, actions, motivations are going to be biologically mediated somehow. And so many features of who we are going to be contingent on factors that are beyond our control, on our genome, on our particular environmental sort of upbringing, and many other kinds of social factors. So a lot of who we are does depend significantly on factors that are beyond our control. Now, it's a further question, I guess, whether or not these aspects of ourselves are going to be appropriate targets for praise and blame. We do admire geniuses, we admire athletes and cheerful babies, right? We might think those are, good traits to have. But I think we're less inclined to take those kinds of traits as appropriate targets of moral judgment or evaluation, right? In the same way that it's not really appropriate to blame me for having blue eyes, say. In some of the literature on moral luck, people have been interested in discussing cases in which, even though what happens depends on factors beyond a person's control, that it's still sort of correct or appropriate to blame someone. It seems to me that even in our legal system, we often take the fact, we take certain factors that diminish control over an action to be mitigating factors, right? So maybe someone still gets a guilty verdict, but if there were certain kinds of sanity or things going on that seem to diminish the level of control that a person has, then we wouldn't assign quite the same level of moral blame that we would if a person did it, in cold blood, say, had been planning out a violent act for over a sustained period of time or something like that. Right. So I guess it seems to me that if an ethicist already had a view on which they were comfortable sort of holding people morally responsible for factors that are outside of our control, it may be that what we learn in neuroscience won't require many adjustments, right? I mean, so some of these are factors that we've been aware of for a long time, and philosophers have been able to think about, not just in the last 15 or 20 years of development in neuroscience, but, we've known about the effects of alcohol consumption or various kinds of pharmacological manipulations or the effects of aging on cognition. We've known about those sorts of things for a long time.
Yeah, good. It makes me think it isn't obvious that there would be a wholesale sort of reassessment of our concept of morality, because a lot of those issues certainly already exist. Well, very good. I've enjoyed these. I've enjoyed your comments. It's been really interesting learning about this. As much as I do work that's empirically informed, it's from a very different sort of venue. So learning about the particularly the roles and so forth has been a really interesting sort of experience. Very much enjoyed your presentation at the conference.
Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, it's been fun chatting, and I likewise think that the work that you're doing on the relevance of emotions is, very interesting and important and even inspiring. So I wish you well as you continue to develop that.
Mm-hmm. Very good. And I should thank the Templeton Foundation for sponsoring our research and making this possible.
Yes, indeed. And also Wake Forest University and the Character Project. We do appreciate that support.